Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I want to talk about some details that have come out about Nihon Falcom's next game. It's the new game in the Kiseki, or rather Trails series of games. This one known as Kuro no Kiseki. This taking place after the events of Hajimari no Kiseki, which I haven't played, which a lot of people haven't played, just because the game only exists in Japan. There hasn't even been any announcements whether or not there's going to be even like an English translation of the game. But I mean, to be fair, the game only came out in August, and obviously even with the Trail series, there has been like obviously a good chunk of time in between those games being only in Japan and them kind of going a little more worldwide. But so I'm not sure what events in Hajimari that this is picking up after, but it is, they made it clear that it's picking up after that. But like I said, for this, I just wanted to kind of talk about some of the details that you know, I read through some of the articles, and you know, just share my thoughts about some of them. Obviously, one of the big things is obviously confirming that this next game is going to be taking place in Calvert, which obviously a lot of stuff kind of already points at. I mean, it makes sense considering like Calvert's always been that place where it's like it's always been mentioned in the background, but you've never actually been there. And now you've been to Liberal, Crossbell, and now Erebonia, so it makes sense that being the next big country, the next story would take place in. So that's not too surprising, but that's definitely going to be interesting, especially because we have gotten hints to what Calvert is kind of like, because obviously over the course of the games you've met people from Calvert. Especially even Crossbell, because Crossbell has that like Eastern influence, and that is kind of pulled from Calvert, because I mean it takes a little bit from, because obviously it's smack dab in the middle of like Calvert and Erebonia, because obviously there's always been that fighting territory over it. But obviously like it kind of hints that there is a lot of Eastern aspects about Calvert. But to be fair, they kind of reference it in the article in particular that it is just labeled as just kind of very multicultural. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see that. But aside from location, we have learned kind of like what your next hub group of characters are going to be centered around, because obviously it's like, well, whether it's the liberal games being, you know, bracers, obviously the SSS and Crossbell, and Class 7 being the main hub group in Erebonia. This one is going to be a place known as Spriggan. I'm sure I'm probably butchering it, but essentially from what they're saying, it's basically an agency that basically deals with a lot of similar stuff that the Bracer Guild would do. So from what I can tell, it seems like it's almost like a detective agency, so it feels like it's like a cross between the SSS and the Bracer Guild, even though like obviously there's a lot of overlap already, but just in what they do, like, you know, because the article is referencing like negotiations, I'm sure, like, you know, wiping out like monsters and stuff like that too. So like a lot of those elements from both those groups kind of combined into one, it seems like is what we're going to get, which would be neat to kind of have, you know. Well, because I would assume you do more detective. I can't say more, but you know, as someone who's never played the Crossbell games, I don't know how much like the detective work really plays into that, considering like Lloyd is technically the only detective amongst the group. But I'd be curious to see, like, would you end up getting more detective cases in this? Like I said, it's not specifically a like detective agency, but obviously it still handles stuff like that, so we would see more of that. Like I said, it's probably just going to be a blend of everything, kind of basically like how Class 7 during their, you know, their field exercises, as well as just everything at the branch camp, is being modeled after kind of like the stuff that bracers do, you know. So I'm sure it's going to be kind of in a similar vein in that regard as well. And because it's also a new location, there's going to be a new battle orbament known as, and I'm going to butcher this, I think it's like Xiphah. It's Xipha, which is, I mean, because obviously in every place you using obviously the orbaments have changed over the course of the games, obviously going from like the Enigmas to like the Arcus, which even you eventually get the Arcus 2 units and stuff like that. So I'm curious to see what this one's going to be like. I'd assume it'd be very similar to the Arcus or Arcus 2, but just like even more advanced. I'd be so curious, because obviously like the Arcus unit going from Arcus 1 to 2, how they modify that, you know, from like being able to have a sub quartz, and then eventually like they added in 4 where you could, you know, do the thing you could do in 2 where you can like upgrade the slots, but then also made it so that like your sub quartz in 4, everyone can share the same one. You don't have to just pick and choose, like only one person can have one sub quartz, that, you know. But like obviously they modified that in 4, so I'd be curious to see what that looks like in this new game. I'm also curious, are they going to revamp a lot of the spells too? Will we see a lot of the same ones or not? Because obviously there's some spells that have been pretty consistent over the the games, but this is also coming from someone who's not that well versed in the Libero or crossbell games. Obviously, I'm more well versed in the Arabonia games, but I'm curious, like, because even those have gotten modified from 1 and 2 to 3 and 4. So I'm curious to see what the new spells might look like. Obviously, maybe see some familiar spells, but different spells at the same time. So I'd just be curious to see how we'll probably see a lot of the same bonus effects. Like, you know, like Ring's starting one will always give him the benefit of like, hey, I always get like an X amount of CP for killing an enemy type of, you know, probably see a lot of recurring abilities like that. Probably some similarities between some of the ornaments, but I mean, but once again, you do have to consider like just the leap and bounds from how stuff worked in the Libero games, because I have become familiar on how like the ornaments work in that. Comparing that to like Code Steel, it's like night and day with how they operate. So it's really interesting. So it could be like a complete overhaul for this new one. Another detail that popped up in this article I thought was really fascinating is the fact is that this game is going to be a one-off, at least in the confines of like its story. Whereas like Code Steel, I mean, not just Code Steel, literally all the other previous games were continuous stories across, you know, obviously like Trails was of course over the course of 3 games, Crossbell over 2, Arabonia over 4, and then you get Hajimari, which is kind of like a combination of everything. But it's one continuous story that's kind of built upon itself. And I think what the article was defining was that basically it's going to be one story, like that this entire game is going to complete its story. It's not going to be a continuous thing. So I'm wondering, is the rest of the Calvard arc going to be like that as well, where each game is just going to, maybe you follow the same characters, but it's like this is a one storyline event that's like, because that's so interesting to think about, because I would think that even if it's a new story that you would still be dealing with the aftermath of it. So I guess I guess the definition would be almost weirdly enough like going from Trails of Cold Steel 2 to 3, even though that is still that connection, but it's almost like a new game to a certain extent. So I guess maybe that's it. Or maybe they are going to have like a new cast of characters in the game after Kuro, but I wouldn't assume so. I don't know. Before the article was also saying that the cast is going to be like 90%. There's going to be 90% new characters, and then like the other 10% are characters. They reference specifically Sky, but maybe there's also probably going to be other characters that you've met in the other games from Crossbell. I mean, not from Calvert, but maybe most of the people you meet from Calvert are people that had already previously popped up. Once again, I'm someone that's only well versed in the Code Steel games. I am going back and trying to become more acquainted with both the Crossbell games as well as the Libero game. But tying that to what I was bringing up too, I do think it's interesting how the number of games goes from 3, 2, 4, and technically 1 and 1. But even if you don't count Hajimari, because you still should, but it's still just interesting that it's like you have a game that's 1, you have a game that's 2, you have a game that's 3, you have another game that's 4. I don't know if they did that on purpose or not, but regardless. I mean, to be fair, once again, it is because because of this way this game seems like it's being structured, it's different compared to the others in that regard, so it can't be seen in that same vein. But I still think it's interesting to make this game kind of a one and done storyline wise. The story of it at the very least is done, but not the entire Calvert arc. I think that's interesting. It also introduces this thing known as the topic system, which I think is kind of an interesting system that basically you gather information from characters or just like NPCs or whatever, and that information can affect stuff later on. There's a game I feel like that's in the back of my mind that I feel like I'm aware of that kind of does a similar thing, but it's basically like if you're able to if you learn this bit of information, it does have an effect. Like, if you learn like there's a discount on certain items, or a shop is kind of the example they gave, like you have an option to select that option and be like, oh, let me get this discount because I found out this information. It's kind of similar to like in Persona 5 in your homeroom class, you have those girls in like one side of the classroom who they always talk about some new stuff that's on sale that might be seasonal stuff. Except them telling you about it doesn't make it appear. I don't think it has any effect. I think it just lets you as a person playing the game know, oh, this is a thing that's only sold on X amount of days or whatever. So I think it's something, I don't think it's in that same vein, but I think it's something similar. That's the best example I can pull from. I know there's probably a better example, but if I gave myself more time, I could probably think of a game that fits that a little bit more. But I think that's such an interesting aspect, because it's something that's come up a little bit, because obviously there were side quests in some of the Trails games where it's like you had to talk to other characters to unlock a certain dialogue tree to a certain extent. It's something in that similar vein, I think, which I think is going to be a fascinating aspect. So I'm sure it's going to be a situation that kind of pushes you to be like, if you're not one of those people that talks to every NPC, which I've talked about it, Trails of Cold Steel broke me at that, because I talked to like every NPC in the game, because you always have to come back because there's so much dialogue, especially because it changes because of certain events throughout the game. But aside from that, like, you know, I think this could be that even more reason to be like, you're going to be missing out on quite a bit if you don't take advantage of talking to like to every NPC. Which also makes me wonder, are they going to keep that talking to every NPC? Because obviously some games have fluctuated with that, where it's like not every NPC is talkable. Like some games, like using Persona 5 for example, makes it so that, I think Persona 4 might have been like this as well, but there's a lot of random like NPCs that you can't talk to, that there's only some, you know, those with speech bubbles or whatever, or dialogue above their head, or, you know, that you can talk to. So I'm wondering, with this next game, are they going to pull back from that, or will they just go, no, we're keeping it saying you can talk to all the NPCs and stuff like that? So I'm be curious, you know, I'm assuming it's, you know, they're going to let you talk to every NPC, but I'm be curious to see if they would change that or not. I wouldn't want them to, but, you know, like I said, just I guess different game companies decide to handle that a little bit differently, you know? And then finally, another key point that was brought up during this article that I found fascinating is this new system known as the alignment frame. Basically, it's kind of like good and bad, where your standing is with a lot of people. That basically a lot of your choices throughout the game will have effect on not just how your interactions with both friendly characters as well as enemy characters. Because this is something I forgot to bring up earlier, because it seems like the group that you work for, the Spriggan or whatever, like, you don't just deal with the good guys, it seems like you deal with criminals as well. I guess it's kind of like, well, I guess it kind of makes sense, because there's the, obviously because of Cold Steel, I'm aware of them, but obviously they've popped up in the other games, it's Hioi, that crime organization and stuff like that. So it's like, which they're kind of, I think, this world's version of like the Yakuza, where it's like, they kind of they're common in that criminal world, but they can do good too if they want to, if it benefits them in the grand scheme of things. So I'm sure you're probably going to have a lot of interactions with them potentially. That's something to kind of think about. But I think that's such an interesting system, and they say it's not like a constantly fluctuating system. It's more like a point-based system, where it's like there's, was it law, order, and then there's a third one, a gray. You know, so like kind of being like, are you more on, which, you know, it's like the gradient scale of like, you know, where you are, you know, in the grand scheme of, obviously gray being very like neutral in the grand scheme of things. But I think that's such an interesting system. And what I also found fascinating was that they said that it carries over into New Game Plus. So I guess that's your way to kind of like decide which way maybe you want to go full one way in one playthrough, then the second way in the second playthrough, and then like the third playthrough go down each one of the routes. Because it wasn't like, I meant to say it, but they also said it also affects story, which I'm like, I'm curious in what way that's going to affect the story, which is kind of interesting, because the article also made a point to state that this game is basically going to be the size of a Trails of Cold Steel game, you know, which is the content and everything, but it's unlike a Cold Steel game, its story is going to be once again concluded in this one game, which I think once again is still so fascinating. So a lot of new systems and elements. I am curious, are they going to bring back the bonding element? Nothing in the article brought that up, but I'd be curious about that. Because I think there's some screenshots out there I didn't take too much of a good look at. I saw a couple here and there. But obviously it was like battle stuff and just NPC, your characters, you get an angle of them and just seeing them kind of run around. But that's like all the screenshots, at least the ones I was looking at, I saw. So there's still a lot to this game we don't know. The game's probably not going to come out till maybe this year, might not even be till next year. I mean, and even then, that's only going to be in Japan, because obviously these games take a long time to get translated. Obviously, 3 didn't come out. Cold Steel 3 didn't come out here until 2019, and obviously we didn't get Cold Steel 4 until late October, because it's, you know, these games take a long time to translate because there's just so much text. As someone kind of informed me, and I was like, yeah, when you look at the grand scheme of things of all the dialogue in it, it makes so much sense why it takes a long time to translate those games, because there's just so much damn dialogue, you know, which isn't a bad thing, you know. It's just, but it's probably just going to be a while before we get the game. I mean, once again, it's like, who knows when we're going to get Haji Mari no Kiseki. I'm butchering the name so much, sorry. regardless, you know what I'm trying to say. But yeah, all of this I find so fascinating as someone who, like I said, recently became obsessed with the Trails of series. So, which I got to just refer to as a Trails series, because saying Trails of just makes me immediately think I'm saying it wrong in my head, because I'm thinking of Tales of. So that's, I just need to just refer to it as a Trails series, which I'm sure you can also say the same thing about the Tales series. Regardless, tangent society and all that. These are just some of my things going through my mind. I'd love to know your thoughts about all of this. Obviously, if you want to like more organized representation of everything, and obviously you'll be able to see some of the screenshots, I'll include a link to the article. I'll leave an annotation at the beginning of the video saying that I'll link to the article, so you don't have to wait to the end of the video to just go to the article if you're curious about it. Yeah. Like I said, just let me know your thoughts about it. What are some things you'd want in this new game? What are some things you expect to see in the new game? Let me know. But really, that's all I want to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.